I'm Debbie Espinora. I'm here with Anna Thompson, and we are from the Northwest eLearn. Excited about our second day, first conference session, designing accessible and inclusive formal and informal online learning. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Zoom chat. Sheryl, would you like to have questions as they come or wait till the end?
I'd like to wait till the end.
Okay, that's good. Then we'll keep track of those. It's going to be recorded and made available on our conference website when it's done being captioned. Speaker slides will also be available. And we want to say thank you for our sponsor, HonorLock, for helping us make the conference possible. It's all about humanizing online proctoring. So if you want to chat with them, head over to their channel in our conference Slack. Now I will hand it over to our speaker. Sheryl, go ahead.
Yes, well, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for joining me about something topic that I dearly love to talk about. We're going to talk today about designing accessible and inclusive formal and informal online learning. You can send me email if you wish. My name is Sheryl Burgstahler. My email is sherylb@uw.edu. And if you'd like access to these slides, I'll send them off to you. You might find them on the conference page, but also I could send them to you directly, plus other resources, or if you just have a question or you want to continue this conversation that we're starting today. So welcome. So I'm from the University of Washington. I direct Accessible Technology Services, and we have two units within my group. The IT Accessibility Team. Since 1984, we've been funded by the University of Washington to make sure that the IT that we procure, develop, and use at the university is accessible to faculty, students, staff, and visitors with disabilities. Back then, we worked mainly on adaptive technology or assistive technology for people with disabilities, but more and more we needed to work on mainstream technology design. So those people who are using assistive technology and others with disabilities can have access to all the tools and the products they create on our campuses. I also direct the Do It Center. I started it in 1992 with a grant from the National Science Foundation and have continued to getting grants from the federal government and the state and private and corporate folks. Anybody will give us some money. We take a little more holistic view. We're not just focused on technology, but how can we improve the success of people with disabilities, put them on a level playing field with everyone else. And I still have an IT focus given my background. We actually have a Do It Center in Japan as well. You might want to look that up. Started in 2007. A lot of Japanese writing on that website. And then the Center on Universal Design and Education, we were funded by the U.S. Department of Education to create and then support this center, which we continue to improve and add resources based on the grants that we're currently getting. So our basic approaches in the Do It Center are when we're working with students, usually students with disabilities, but other students as well, we promote self-determination. Broadly speaking, that's just the knowledge and skills and networking and technology, everything you need to achieve success and whatever you're trying to become successful in. But then when we're working with institutions or faculty and staff, technology companies, we promote universal design. So in the way of companies, we work with Google and Microsoft and Amazon to help them make sure that their products that they are deploying online are accessible to individuals with disabilities. So this presentation kind of builds on that universal design framework, as you'll see, but has more to offer. We're going to be talking about some strategies for making an online course, whether it's formal or informal, accessible to people with disabilities and others as well. For those of you that know about universal design, it's a much broader concept than just disability. And at the end, we're hoping to have some time to entertain some particular suggestions. So if you have some tips about making your online course more inclusive of just about anybody, just put them in chat. And so by the end of this, we'll have a list of things that we can all look at and gain ideas from. So what do I mean by making informal or formal courses accessible to everyone? Well, anyone who meets the requirements with or without accommodations is encouraged to participate. If you're running an online learning program for people to register in that program, do you put a statement on there telling someone who wants to register how they can request an accommodation? A very important thing to encourage people with disabilities to attend. It sends the message that we are expecting people with disabilities to attend, and we're interested in any of your needs and accommodations you might require. People feel welcome. If in your online class you have a little welcoming video, which I do in my class, which I'm teaching now at City University of New York, all online. If my little introductory video, like many of us have, is not captioned accurately, it's kind of a mean trick when you think about it for people who are English language learners or people who are deaf, two groups that really rely on these captions, and many others benefit from them as well. Simple fix to that is that if you're putting them up on YouTube or some other platform, they have editing features. And so all you need to do is go into the editing features and we'll edit those computer generated captions for you. That would make a person who's deaf, an English language learner, and many others feel more welcome in your class. And everyone is fully engaged in accessible and inclusive environments and activities. That might be kind of a high mark for some people, but me, it's just like, should be just assumed that we're going to do that in our classes. So how are we going to do that? First of all, my personal goal in online and whether opportunities, whether they be informal or formal, is to make the formal and informal online courses accessible to all students, period, except for a little more explanation, including those who are members of groups defined by gender identity, race, ethnicity, neurodiversity, levels of ability to hear, see, move, pay attention, and manage physical and mental health and other characteristics. I was using this goal with a couple of people the other day, just using that in a grant proposal I was writing. And they said, are you trying to avoid the word disability? I said, well, not really, but I want to be more explicit. Someone may have difficulty paying attention. They might not be diagnosed as having a disability, like attention deficit disorder, but they have difficulty paying attention. And so my view on that is for most of us, including online instructors, we can just look at ability. We're all in this group here today. We all have different abilities, all of us, where a few of us or none of us have disabilities. But when we talk about ability, that's fully inclusive of everybody on the planet. And so what would we have an ability in? I have a double-edged arrow here from not able to able. And if you look at the first item here, the ability to understand English, I might rate myself a little low in this category. If I happen to be an English language learner, I might think, well, I'm not real strong in English, but I'm pretty good. But it also might be because of learning disability that makes it difficult for you to understand English to the same level as maybe your peers. Similarly, for social norms, there might be a disability related to it, like being on the autism spectrum, where many students have difficulty picking up on social norms, but it might just simply be because you grew up in a different culture. And so you have some confusion regarding social norms here in the United States. So the point is that our abilities can be related to disability, or they can just be related to other things, your environment or some other historical aspect of who you are, and so forth. So the ability to hear or see or walk or read print, write with a pen or a pencil, communicate verbally, tune out distraction, to learn to manage physical and mental health. And so the point is here that we should be thinking about people on this continuum who might be in our class. Some online instructors say, well, maybe I should survey my class on the first day and see if anyone wants to disclose what they need if they have a disability. I say, you're too late. You're in the first class. You should have thought of that before you offer the first class, including what your syllabus and so forth. And also, if they haven't disclosed to the Disability Services Office, what makes you think they're going to disclose to you? Because you do know about the students who have disclosed to that Disability Services Office, because you get the little letter usually telling you that they have an approved accommodation. But another thing that's important for faculty to learn is that most disabilities they're invisible. And so you can't tell if a disability if someone has a disability, whether it's online or on site, you can't tell. And that only about fewer than 1/3 or even 1/4 of students with disabilities actually report them to the Disability Services Office. When I talk to faculty members about this, often I'll get the question, well, why not? Why would that be? Why wouldn't they want to report to that office? Well, I always have to respond. I can't answer that. It's a very personal question. But what I've heard from some students with disabilities is they're worried about you discriminating against them, that you might have lower expectations, that you might feel like they don't belong in your class. and so forth. And so maybe they could use a accommodation, but they're not asking for it. But also many people with disabilities don't have a disability that requires accommodation, even though it might impact their participation in a course. And then disability services is charged primarily with offering accommodations to the individuals in your course, the students in this case. And so they're not like working for the faculty so much, but they're working directly with the students who happen to disclose in their office. And that then they're working with a class many times, it's already been created. And so they have to deal with any inaccessibility issues that they discover along the way. By the way, as we're looking at technology, some of the more expensive accommodations for online courses, and we really learned this in the pandemic, by the way, is making inaccessible documents accessible. And that's mainly reformatting PDF files. I often get asked, well, what's wrong with PDF? Well, it's just that not as easy to make accessible as just HTML, which is the hypertext, the language of the web, which is on the page of your content pages in your learning management system. That's HTML. And you can format them with that using heading structure and other things like lists, defining lists and so forth, and those structures. But that's the easiest to make accessible, probably, arguably. And Microsoft Word is even easier to make accessible than PDF. And the other problem with PDF is if you go back and try to edit it, like a syllabus or whatever, you might lose some of the accessibility you got built in. So if you want to use PDFs, that's great. Just make sure you take a workshop and learn how to make them accessible. Otherwise, disability services is going to have to make them accessible to who? Well, to students who are blind using screen readers that read the text. But if you have a scanned in image, their screen reader won't read it because it's not really text, it's just a picture of text. But also people who are blind can benefit from the formatting structure that I already mentioned, because their screen readers are really smart. And so they'll tell them when a list is coming up, there's a list with 7 items, or when heading is at heading level 2 or heading level 3, that's real beneficial to them. So the other issue is captioning videos. We already talked about that a bit, that if you just simply don't edit those captions that you create yourself, then the Disability Services Office may need to do that for you as an accommodation for a deaf student. And again, that English language learner student isn't going to benefit because they are not a target of that particular office, Disability Services. So we're going to talk today about the framework of universal design, which is just simply the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. This was created by the Center for Universal Design years ago, last century. So it's been around a long time and has guidelines and principles that go with it. On the screen right now, I have an example of a universally designed product. It's a name tag that you might see in an online or an on-site conference with the plastic holder and the lanyard. But it's a universally designed one. So that lanyard actually has a clip on it, or it has a ring on it, a metal ring at the bottom, but there's a clip on the plastic name tag holder, and that clip can connect to the lanyard, but it also can disconnect from the lanyard. If you wanted to use the clip to fix the name tag to your collar, which I prefer to do when possible, and then there's a safety pin that goes through it, so you can pin it on. So that gives the user the choice on how they want to use their name tag. Also, it has large print, and this is for a conference where first name is the practice, and so it says Sheryl in bright large letters. And then on the back, it has the same content as the front. And so you don't get in a situation at a reception where the name tag of someone flips over and you have to decide whether you're going to do that for them. It can be awkward. So universal design, in a nutshell, it means that characteristics of universal design is it's accessible to people with disabilities, usable by everyone. In your course, you can easily manage your course and find what you're supposed to do next and so forth, but inclusive as well. So you minimize the number of things you might provide just to students with certain types of disabilities, like having to remediate documents, and you design them accessibly at the get-go, and so everyone has access to the same documents. What happens with universal design is you end up having then fewer accommodations. And so the images on the screen kind of point that out dramatically, where the first one has an image of universal design, Inside that is accommodations, because I consider accommodations as part of the universal design process, but you have to provide a lot of them if you haven't given a lot of thought to universal design. On the right-hand side shows someone who's given a lot of thought to universal design, and in their online class, they might have captioned videos and they have accessible documents and some other practices that I hope some of you are putting in chat right now, some practices that make your online course more inclusive to students with disabilities, but everybody else as well. And so the accommodation sphere inside here is much smaller. And so it reduces the number of accommodations you might need. We have a good example of it with curb cuts. We have an image right now of a young man in a wheelchair. This picture was on the front page of the UW Daily, our student newspaper, in 1970, a long time ago. It says in caps, he was clearly shouting, "Ramp the curbs, get me off the street." And so this is a young man who was promoting putting curb cuts in sidewalks. And that was very controversial at the time. It no longer is. Pretty much all sidewalks in the United States and many other countries have curb cuts in them. And they're used by wheelchair users, but mainly they're used by people pushing baby strollers or delivery carts and maybe even some skateboarders. I like to emphasize the inclusiveness of universal design compared to accommodations. And the image right here, this is another image in the physical environment. We have a ramp that's right next to an entrance to a building here at the university that has 2 steps. ADA compliant. There are handrails for both the steps and the ramp. The ramp is just a gradual slope. And so it's ADA compliant and it's very usable, very accessible, but it's not inclusive compared to this other building, also at the University of Washington, where we have a very gradual sloping ramp going into the entrance, and it's quite wide. So first case, if I'm going into that building with a colleague who's using a wheelchair, we have to part ways because she can't go up the steps and I can't fit beside her in the ramp. And so I'll go up the steps. So I'm just not in the way. Where on the right, we can walk in side by side. And it's wide enough that people can pass us. Now, there are many steps in this building, so we're not discriminating against people who want to use steps. We're just saying that primary entrance is the most accessible. And so that's where we want our courses. That should be our goal, that it's accessible. And then if accommodations are needed, well, we'll provide those accommodations as well. Our iPhones are a good example of universal design too, with all those accessibility features. You can change the foreground and background color. You can increase the character size. It can talk to you. Those are accessibility features that used to be assistive technology that people would buy as add-ons. And now they're built in. And so we want to build in things in our online classes as well. It doesn't mean we won't need more assistive technology for someone with a disability. The example I present here is someone who has a computer, for example, that might still have difficulty accessing it, maybe because they're unable to use a mouse. They may have some assistive technology, although I'll talk about the limitations of that in a minute. But also someone who needs a Braille embosser so they can do their own brailing can actually get Braille translation software and a Braille embosser and create their own Braille. This would be anyone can use it, but a blind person it's accessible to them as well. So we still need assistive technology, but not as much. So what I'm asking what faculty members to do when I train them on how to make courses accessible is to be thinking proactively, which means you're thinking about who might enroll in your class. You're not waiting until they enroll in your class, and the assistive technologies that might be using. And that can be overwhelming to many people because there are thousands of assistive technologies students with disabilities and others actually might be using who are enrolled in your class. I'll just share 4 stories. And my guidance to faculty is think about these 4 people and see if you can make your course accessible, or at least reasonably accessible to them, to minimize accommodations they might need. And so if we look at this screen, the first one on the screen is Anthony. Anthony has multiple physical disabilities. He does not have, he cannot walk, he cannot effectively use his hands for a lot of things, but he has hand control enough that he can use a large keyboard that he has strapped to his wheelchair, so he can press the keys one at a time. He does not have a usable voice, but with his keyboard, he can type in messages And then he can use text-to-speech software to read them aloud to someone that he's meeting in person, but also on the telephone, because he provides phone support, technical phone support on assistive technology, usually to parents of children that have been recently diagnosed with a condition similar to his. And so that's very cool. But how does he does it? Well, he has a computer. The computer has a physical connection with the phone. And then there is, he uses this translation software so you can text, you can write the text in, and then it is spoken through a computerized voice on the phone. And that's how he carries on a conversation. Might seem a little cumbersome to some of us, but that's the only way that Anthony can be independent in those phone conversations. So it's critical to his career to be able to do this. ... What's the point here? Well, Anthony has a lot of technologies and he knows how to use them. But those that are of us who might be creating a website or a course or some other technological product, what you need to know about all this technology is it does a beautiful job at emulating the mouse, the keyboard. And so anything any of us can do on the keyboard alone, Anthony can do. But assistive technology hasn't developed to the point that it does a very good job with the mouse. And so if you can see this image, you'll see it doesn't have anything that looks like it might be a mouse. And there are some ways people with physical disabilities can use a mouse, but not Anthony, so not in this case. And so what that means, if you're creating a website and you have a pull-down menu that people access usually using a mouse, just make sure that you can access that menu in other ways, maybe using the arrow keys or something, because Anthony can do anything that you can do on the keyboard, but he doesn't necessarily need to use the mouse. We don't even see features like this. Why? Because if we're using a mouse, it works. We don't try to explore further to see if you could access it a different way. But it's critically important to Anthony in that respect. Jessie has multiple learning disabilities. She is neurodiverse, as some people would refer to her. She has difficulty getting her thoughts on paper or on the keyboard. And so she dictates her content, let's say in an email message, she'll dictate. But she also has difficulty reading and picking up spelling errors. So she uses text-to-speech software to read back to her after she's composed this message and then to correct errors. Seems like a bit of cognitive overhead, but this worked great for Jessie, but she's had many years of practice in doing all of that. So Jessie, what do we need to know as an instructor? Well, we need to know, we don't need to know about her dictation software. We do need to know that she needs to be able to read the content in the course. And so she needs to be able to have access to the text. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. And so if you're putting out a document that's a scanned in PDF, Jessie can't use her text-to-speech software to read it aloud to her. Similarly with documents you find on the internet that are scanned in documents. And so that's important. If you're creating a document, like say in PDF, you've decided, I want to use PDF for my syllabus, make sure that the text is there and accessible to Jessie, not just an image of text. Nicole on the far right of these images is blind. She too needs access to that text, let's say in a PDF or a Word document, or just in your content page. And so having access to the text benefits her. But unlike Jessie, she can't actually see the screen and see what the organization is, where the headings are, and so forth. And so you need to help her screen reader describe those to her by using heading structure, H1, H2, H3, and so forth, and bullet lists and enumerated lists as well, using that structure in the document, but also there's some for tables and other things that can benefit her. She also can't get access to the image content because she can't see it, where Jessie can actually see those images. And so if there's critical content in an image, it needs to be described for her. And you can use alternative text, a feature that's in all the systems you'd be using, your content management system or Word or other document structure. So you just need to be sure to use them. Those features are in them. And then there's Adrian, and Adrian's deaf. And so as I mentioned earlier, we just need to make sure we have captions and transcriptions to make sure that Adrian can access the content of our classes. So again, faculty, just think about these 4 people. If they can all access the content in your class, you're doing a pretty good job. And to reinforce this idea that universal design is for everyone and is designed to benefit everyone, or at least most everyone, if you take a look at captions, they benefit people who cannot hear the audio, but also people who are English language learners, as I mentioned. What if they're in a noisy environment? We've experienced that in the airport, or a noiseless location like a library, where you might want to watch a video and could turn the sound off. Those who have a slow internet connection that might choose to turn off the visuals. Someone who wants to know the spelling of words. That's pretty much all of us, but particular students in a class, and to need to find the content real quickly. Because if you have text-based captions and you have a display that will allow you can actually search through all those captions to find specific content. So in summary, if you practice universal design, I'm calling it universal design in education here, UDE, there are 3 sets of principles that I think could guide you in this. And there's a lot of literature and web content on the principles and guidelines that they support, but I'll just mention them here. Universal design, I think, is a broad term that covers both of the other 2 I'm going to share, but it has 7 principles that go along with that definition I gave a few slides ago. But there are also some other guidance. There's other guidance on universally designing your class. One was developed for, particularly for faculty and instructors at all educational levels by the CASH Center. It's called Universal Design for Learning. And there are 3 basic principles that guide you in how to develop your curriculum and your pedagogy for students. And then we can't forget IT, especially when I'm in the room. And so we have special guidance for that as well. It's been around for a long time. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And even though it has web in the term and in its title, it can be used to guide all IT in its development. And there are actually 4 basic principles that underpin all the practices and guidelines that go along with that. So that's kind of complicated, but we can make it not so complicated. For me, what it boils down to, if you look at all these 3 sets, which I've done a lot, probably as much as any other human being, if you look at all 3 of them, provide multiple ways for participants to do what? To learn, like use a video and a handout, to demonstrate what they've learned, different ways to show that they've learned something, looking at their discussion posts, looking at small assignments, large projects, and so forth, and engage. In my syllabus, right at the top, I say, I introduce myself to my students. I say, if you'd like to meet with me one-on-one, just arrange a time when we can meet, and you can choose how you'd like to meet. I used to say in person. Now I don't in this day and age. It's more online, but it could be by email, could be in the software that we're using for bulletin boards. It could be Skype, it could be Zoom. And the point here is I asked them to choose how they'd like to meet. I would much prefer Zoom, but again, this is something that's for them, not me. And so just give them an option. Those that choose to meet me via email, I'm just suspicious. I don't ask for people to disclose their reasons, but I think they tend to be English language learners and people where their disability, like Anthony, affects their ability to speak. And so both probably need a little more time to compose their thoughts and so forth. So whatever, take it as you will. The second one is to make sure that all technologies, facilities, services, resources, and strategies are accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities. And so we need to look at the technologies we're using, but lucky for us, commonly used learn management systems like Blackboard and like Canvas, they have been hearing from people like my organization for years and have built in a lot of accessibility features. Zoom is another product that's highly accessible. It's not perfect, but it was much less than perfect when we adopted it years ago at the University of Washington. And the group that chose Zoom was, everyone voted for it except one, and now one that voted against it was on my team because it wasn't accessible. And so we lost, but we won, and that we go to our next step, which is get some wording in the contract that said that they will work with my team to continue to improve the accessibility of Zoom. And they signed that contract, and they did, and have really benefited from that now in the pandemic, with so much use of Zoom for various audiences. And I don't know why we didn't put in that contract some kind of a little kickback to the IT accessibility team for all that work we've done. But oh well, missed opportunity. I actually taught the first course at the University of Washington, was offered fully online. It was 1993. I must have been just a teenager, I guess. I can't remember. It was very long ago. And I taught it with a Dr. Norm Coombs, who was actually blind. And it was about adaptive technology for people with disabilities. We used email, a discussion list, Gopher, server, Telnet, file transfer protocol. Notice that the internet is not here. That was not an option at the time. And so you really could still give an online class back then. Didn't have the bells and whistles we have now. All the materials were in text. The publications, captions, and audio publications were captioned. Publications were accessible. Audio described, VHS tapes for the videos we used. So the point being that this is not new. We made our course fully accessible. We did not require anybody disclose their disability. And we had a lot of people who took this course over the years that we offered it, who had disabilities, because they would volunteer disclosure. And so these principles and these practices have been around for a long, long time, but maybe not articulated quite so much. We developed a handout for 20 tips for making an online course accessible. And it's kind of just get faculty members started, because a lot of this can be really overwhelming to a faculty member that has just heard the news that they could and should make their courses inclusive of everyone. And so the handout is, the image of it is presented on the screen. The title of it is making an online 20 tips for teaching an accessible online course. I didn't use the words universal design, but that's really what it's about, because accessible, I think, is a word that's known more than by the public than universal design. Didn't want to be too jargony. And so you can search for this with a Google search, and what you'll get is a list of the 20 that I'm going to only share a few of, and you'll get references. And so being careful about choices of color, for example, I'll give you a reference on how you can learn more about that, and so forth. The list was developed from a literature review and reports of online instructors, including myself, but also students with disabilities who've been on panels sponsored by the Do It Center to share with online learning instructors how to make their courses accessible. And so let's see what this has to say. I'm just going to give just these 2 screens worth of ideas, and I'll remind you what I'd like you to do is put some comments in chat, some practices that you've employed, or even that you've just thought of, given what we've talked about so far, that make a course more inclusive of people with disabilities, but other groups as well. Remember, universal design goes beyond disability. That's kind of our focus here today, but it goes beyond that. And how can you decide if it's universally designed? If your practice makes a step toward making things accessible, that means technically accessible to a person with a disability, but also usable. Things like making your course organized in a way that it's easier to negotiate. So often we look at our class, and if we've created a class, the thousands of times we've looked at it, of course it makes sense, but you have to go through it sometime during that process, and several times perhaps. What if I don't know where I am? I'm in this module and I don't even have any idea what I'm supposed to do. Don't require that the student look back at the syllabus for something as simple as that. Make sure it's within your modules that tells them where they're going next. And so things like that, that's universal design. It's also just plain old good design, frankly. But if you have an idea or something you've employed actually, where you've made things more accessible, technically, you've made things more usable, which was my last example, or you've made things more inclusive. Perhaps you had an assignment that wasn't accessible. I have an assignment in my this class that I'm teaching. It's actually on universal design in higher education. So I get into this a lot and feel the pressure of making my course accessible. But I had an assignment I wanted them to do about universal design in physical spaces. So in the bulletin board, I started with a question that was something along the lines of go out on the internet and see if you can find a picture of a space that has employed universal design in some way, but is not labeled as such. You can't go to a universal design page and take things off there. And then share that on the bulletin board and explain why you considered that universal design. Well, I immediately think, okay, who couldn't do this without an accommodation? Well, that's a pretty easy one. A blind person couldn't do that without getting assistance from a sighted person or asking for an accommodation. So I thought, well, how can I make that accessible to that person? And it was fairly easy, actually. I changed the assignment. I kind of described it as I just did, but then I had a different little paragraph that says, as an alternative, describe a physical space you've actually been in where there was a feature that you would consider universal design, and explain why you consider that a universal design feature. And then I had to add something else because I thought, well, this blind person, how are they going to read the other people's responses? And so I said, for all of them, for all of your responses, for any images that you use, describe those images for someone who can't actually see the images. So I don't say for blind people or whatever that can't see the images. I don't know why, but they can't see the images. And so what I did is I turned an inaccessible assignment that would require accommodations for some students into a universally designed assignment. So everyone can participate without assistance and without disclosure. And it's interesting that there are people who I don't think are blind, but I don't know for sure because my course is so accessible, you wouldn't have to disclose blindness. But I think are not blind that use that second alternative. Why, I don't ask, but my guess is they just had an experience that, oh yeah, I was out at this auditorium and it was really accessible, and and they want to talk about that, their own personal experience, and this gives them an opportunity to do so. So here are some of the things that are in this 20 tips checklist. Videos that are captioned. Audio description I haven't talked about, but that's another feature where you can add some content to describe visual things that you don't, that are not described orally in your video. For example, if I had some video in my video, if I had a URL or something I wanted to put in my video, but I just had it presented visually, audio description could provide it a description of it. Better is just to include that description in the video itself, so it's inclusive. Everybody gets that version, but sometimes you do have to add some audio. That's going to take a little more work than just the video, but it's worth capturing, but it's worth looking into. And back to making things inclusive, clear instructions. Students who are considered neurodiverse might have a learning disability or be on the autism spectrum. They really need clear instructions. And when students with disabilities are in panels, that comes up all the time from kids with different types of disabilities. And it's so not what you really think of when you think of accessibility, I think, at least for the first time. Consistent layouts and organization. I give what I think are clear instructions, but once in a while, it's not unusual, a student will say, I didn't understand this. And we meet by Zoom, or however they want to meet, or I just email them or whatever. But I always take the additional step of looking back at those instructions and figuring out why that student was confused. And almost always, I can come up with some minor change in the wording or something that would make it more inclusive the next time I use it. Avoid PDFs. Like I said, if you want to use them, great, go and get some instruction. It will be extra work, but you can do that. Use structured headings, I mentioned, in lists. Tables have some structure too. Descriptive text for hyperlinks and content in images. Be able to be sure that you describe those. Now, I talked about the images and those being important for people who are blind, but hyperlinks also, look what I said here, descriptive text for hyperlinks. Think of if you're teaching a class, your online content page, that content page in your Canvas or your Blackboard or whatever learning management system you're using, look at that content page. If you have several links, which mine often do you name them all the same thing for consistency? Click here, click here, click here. Well, if a student who is blind is taking your class, they would be using a screen reader. And so if they want to go back to a module where they remember there was this link they wanted to revisit, but they're going to hear, because their screen reader can tab between those links and read the text of the link so they know what you're linking to, we'll hear, click here, click here, click here. So their alternatives are to just click to them and figure out where they link to until they find the right one, or to go back and read all of the surrounding text, figure out where they're linking to. So that's kind of an inconvenience. And it's really easy to do, not even that hard to change if you've already done them the other way. So it should say things like, the underlined text should say, do it website, web content accessibility guidelines, universal design for learning. It should say what you're linking to. Keep it short though. And then make sure that you use large, bold sans serif fonts, uncluttered pages, plain backgrounds, high contrast color combinations, and no reliance on color alone. So you can use color, but don't rely on it, because someone in your course might be colorblind. And so if you're asking to make a choice between one button and another, don't make them both round and one green and one red. Make one round and one square and green and red. And so you can say, hit the green square button if you want to choose this or whatever. So just not, you don't have to deal with it. You can do color checkers and they're linked from the document I told you about, but why just avoid it altogether. Give students multiple ways to learn, to demonstrate learning and engage. We talked about that as universal design in education, closely aligned with universal design for learning, that one statement. Use plain English, spell and define acronyms. Really be careful about jargon that we use commonly. And remember, we're the expert on this topic, and so we use it all the time. Make sure that you spell them out, the jargon, define the jargon, and spell out acronyms. Use adequate time for projects, especially big ones. I put my big final project clearly defined, described in the syllabus. And so they can work the whole term on it. And that allows them extra time. And then giving feedback on parts and corrective opportunities for assignments. So when we look at universal design, it's an attitude, it's a goal, it's a framework, it's a process that values diversity, equity, and inclusion, promotes best practices, it doesn't lower standards, it's proactive, can be implemented incrementally, benefits everybody, and minimizes the need for accommodations. And the final slide just has some resources on here. Again, I will send you my PowerPoint presentations if you send me an email message, and an email is at the bottom of the screen, sherylb@uw.edu.
Sheryl, thank you so much. Everybody give a little love. This is a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. We do have one question from Sky, and they ask, what are your thoughts or tips for providing alternative text for images such as diagrams or detailed images?
Good question. Great question. You need to provide descriptions for it. First of all, if it's a complicated image, I'd first look at the image. Can it be broken down into parts? Sometimes it's making 2 points and you can kind of separate it, or in a table as well. Can a multi-tiered table be broken down into 2 simpler ones? That actually can benefit a lot of people, frankly. Okay, then there are ways you can describe things. There are guidelines that people have developed, sometimes with the National Science Foundation funding. The best way to describe, let's say, computer science images that are in those courses, or engineering courses, those diagrams are very complex. And so there are details for that as well. So the bottom line is you need to describe it somehow in text. And if you weren't going to those guidelines, which I would recommend you that you look at, my main advice is, okay, what if a person is on a phone and this is your only chance to describe them what you had on your PowerPoint? What would you tell them? And my guess is you can come up with something that's less complicated than you think you have to provide, because sometimes the image is projecting something that goes beyond just the little details in it. The other piece of advice, really avoid unimportant details. The color of a a circle or something if it's not critical that they know what that color is. So you can keep it real simple.
Okay, one last question before we sign off from Kim. Any tips for how you negotiate with ed tech vendors for accessibility features and development?
Well, that's tough. I would first, if you're interested in that category of things, I'd have you join the ATHEN, ATHEN discussion list. And this is a group of professionals at post-secondary institutions like mine, our IT accessibility team, and they deal with this all the time. And you'll get contradictory responses. But if you are trying to make a product accessible, you're wanting to communicate with the vendor, give them some specific guidelines, like the World Wide Web's content accessibility guidelines, level 2.0 or 2.1, level AA or something. If you have standards at your institution or in the state, use those. And so kind of informing them of that. But the ATHEN list is a good place to post something. Has anybody found a way to make such and such accessible, or working with the vendor? Because sometimes you'll find a community of people that are already doing it. We have a very active community, as I mentioned, working on Zoom and Canvas, actually, because their products we're using on our campus. We're a large campus, so we can afford to do that. And you and the smaller schools can benefit from what we do. And then come up with some standard wording to use in a contract where they'll agree to work on making their websites or their whatever they're contracted for, the technology that they're producing, accessible, and work toward WCAG 2.1 AA, something like that. Because if you say they have to make it fully accessible, it might be a deal breaker on the contract, and you might need that product.
Nice. Anna got that website up in our chat as well. And so is our evaluation of the session survey. If you guys would just take a few minutes and do that for us, that would be really great. I see a lot of thank yous. And so we're going to close out our session today. Sheryl, thank you so much. The rest of you, join us again at 11 for our next session, and hope you have a great week.